When history is told, the spotlight almost never shines on those who worked in silence. We hear about emperors and queens, revolutions and wars, but what about the women who kept those palaces running? The maids who scrubbed the marble floors until their hands bled, who carried water to wash away the dirt of others, who stood in corners waiting to be called, yet were never truly seen. This is the untold story of the people who lived in shadows, not because they wanted to, but because society decided they belonged there. For centuries, maids were stripped of their individuality. Many weren't even addressed by their real names. They were called the girl, the help, or worse, by nicknames that erased their dignity. Their labor was constant, but their humanity invisible, the erasure of identity. Imagine being a young girl, perhaps only 12 years old, leaving your family because poverty left no choice. You enter the home of strangers, not as a guest, but as a servant. From that moment, your name is forgotten. You no longer belong to your family's world, and you will never belong to the household you serve. In Victorian England, this was the reality for 1 out of every 3 women. Across colonial India, girls were taken from villages to work in British-owned houses where they became both essential and disposable. In the American South, long after slavery was abolished, black women were funneled into domestic work as the only option available: cleaning, cooking, and raising children of families who would never accept them as equals. And yet, despite this harshness, these women created entire inner worlds. In their silence, they carried memories, prayers, and songs. Many would hum traditional lullabies to themselves while scrubbing dishes, or whisper old folk tales under their breath as they folded laundry. These weren't just private comforts. They were acts of survival. Life in the shadows of wealth, the paradox is striking. The grandest homes could not function without them, but the women who kept those homes running were never allowed to enjoy their beauty. They cooked meals that filled the dining halls with rich aromas, but ate scraps in the kitchen. They dressed noblewomen in silk gowns and jewels, but wore the same tattered uniforms every day. They polished silver plates that they were never allowed to touch when guests arrived. Their work was endless, dawn to midnight and often beyond. And when guests marveled at the beauty of a banquet, or when royalty was praised for their elegance, no one thought of the maid who had spent hours sewing, scrubbing, or preparing in the background. To be a maid was to exist without acknowledgement, to live in a world where your body was exhausted, your spirit overlooked, and your very existence treated as a shadow. Small acts of humanity, but here lies the secret. Even in such conditions, humanity cannot be erased. These women built hidden worlds in the corners of grand estates, a stolen piece of bread saved in an apron pocket, a quick smile exchanged with another servant while the master wasn't looking. A few whispered words of kindness to a child they were forbidden to hug, a hidden letter tucked beneath a mattress, never sent but written to remind themselves they still had a voice. For many maids, these tiny acts were their rebellion, their proof that they were more than the role forced upon them. They were women with thoughts, emotions, and dreams, even if society refused to recognize them. The beginning of a larger truth. This is where the story begins. The secret lives of maids are not just about labor. They are about resilience. They are about people who, though unseen, shaped families, cultures, and nations. Because behind every polished floor and shining chandelier, there was a woman whose hands made it possible. Behind every well-raised child of the elite, there was a maid who sacrificed raising her own. History may have erased their names, but their lives still whisper to us, and those whispers demand that we listen. The endless hours domestic service wasn't just a job, it was a sentence. For most maids, the day began before the household woke and ended long after everyone slept. In Victorian households, some maids woke at 4 a.m. to light fires and polish shoes, then worked past midnight cleaning after dinner parties. In colonial Asia, maids were expected to stay on their feet for 16 to 18 hours a day, without rest, without complaint. In American households, black maids not only cleaned and cooked but often cared for white children, while their own families went neglected. There were no weekends, no time off, no personal lives. Their existence revolved entirely around the whims of others. If the master wanted tea at midnight, the maid delivered. If the lady wanted her gown pressed before dawn, it was done. The body broke first, aching joints, raw hands, hollow stomachs, but over time the soul followed, hollowed out by years of servitude. Exploitation. Without boundaries, but labor was only one form of struggle. The deeper wound came from exploitation that knew no boundaries. Many maids were vulnerable to abuse, physical, verbal, and often, tragically, sexual. They had no power to refuse, no voice to protest, no court to hear them. A master's word was law, and a maid's silence was assumed. In countless households, the line between servitude and slavery blurred. Young girls were treated as possessions, punished for mistakes as small as spilling tea, sometimes beaten for speaking out of turn. If they complained, they were dismissed with no pay, their reputations destroyed. And then came the humiliation. Being spoken down to, treated as though they were less than human. Some employers refused to allow maids to use the same utensils, the same toilets, or even to be seen in the same spaces as the family they served. Their dignity was stripped away in small, relentless ways. They were always the other, necessary but unwanted, present but erased. The price of separation. Perhaps the greatest cruelty was the forced separation from their own families. Many maids left behind children they could barely feed, husbands they could not support, parents they would never see again. They spent their lives raising someone else's children, while their own grew up motherless. In stories collected from former domestic workers across Latin America and Africa, one theme repeats: regret. Women who poured love into children who weren't their own often returned home years later to find their own families broken, their children distant, their homes gone. And yet society rarely asked about this loss. The pain of these women was invisible, buried beneath the polished image of the families they served. The silent bond of suffering. But in silence, something remarkable happened. A shared bond of suffering. Maids found each other in the hidden corners of kitchens and servants' quarters. They spoke in whispers, traded secrets, and built friendships that carried them through the darkest nights. They invented secret codes to warn each other of an angry master. They shared scraps of food when one went hungry. They told stories, sang songs, and kept each other alive, not just physically, but emotionally. This community became their resistance. Even if they couldn't escape, they could survive together. A world that chose not to see. The real tragedy is this: society chose not to see. The people who depended most on these women, their employers, the children they raised, the homes they kept spotless, rarely acknowledged their struggles. To them, the maid's exhaustion, hunger, or heartbreak wasn't real. She was not a woman with dreams. She was a shadow meant to serve. And so, generation after generation, the cycle continued. Poverty forced girls into service. Service erased their identities. And erasure ensured that their struggles remained hidden, unspoken, unrecorded. The deeper question. But here's the deeper question. What does it mean for a society when an entire class of women is treated as less than human? It means that progress, wealth, and beauty were often built on the backs of invisible suffering, that every chandelier, every banquet, every display of refinement came at the cost of someone else's dignity. And when we ignore that truth, we don't just erase the past, we continue its injustice. Resilience in the shadows, to live as a maid was to live in constant exhaustion. But resilience was woven into every action. When they stitched torn garments with aching fingers, they were also stitching together their will to endure. When they scrubbed floors until their hands cracked, they carried within them the knowledge that survival itself was an act of defiance. Many maids were denied education, but they taught themselves in secret. Some learned to read letters discarded by their employers. Others memorized prayers, songs, or poetry whispered at night. To the world, they were uneducated girls. To themselves, they were keepers of culture, knowledge, and wisdom, passed quietly from one generation to another. The secret worlds. They built, behind the heavy doors of kitchens and servants' quarters, hidden worlds flourished. Friendship, bonds formed over shared pain. Maids often treated each other as sisters, mothers, and confidants. One maid's laughter could ease another's tears after brutal scolding. Storytelling. They told tales, folklore, from their villages, stories of ancestors, or even imagined worlds where maids were queens. These stories kept hope alive. Music and song. Many hummed quietly as they worked. These songs were more than tunes. They were threads connecting them to families and traditions they could not return to. Small rebellions. A loaf of bread saved. An extra blanket smuggled into a servant's room. Even resting for 5 stolen minutes while pretending to polish silver. These tiny acts weren't laziness. They were survival strategies. To outsiders, these worlds were invisible. But for the maids, they were everything. The power of care. One of the strangest paradoxes of servitude was this. The same women who were treated as less than human often became the emotional backbone of the families they served. They raised the children of their masters, teaching them songs, comforting them when they cried, telling them bedtime stories. Those children often bonded more deeply with their maids than with their own parents. And yet, when the children grew, many would adopt the same prejudices of their class. The maid who once kissed their scraped knees became just the help. Still, the love maids poured into those moments was real, and it was powerful. It was a quiet strength that shaped entire generations, even if history refused to name it. Resilience. Through faith and ritual. For many maids, faith was the only place they could reclaim dignity. In hidden corners, they whispered prayers. Some created small altars out of scraps, a candle stub, a flower, a picture of a saint. Others carried charms or recited verses under their breath while working. Faith gave them a sense of identity larger than the uniforms they wore. It reminded them that they were not invisible to God, even if they were invisible to society. The legacy of quiet resistance. When we speak of rebellion, we imagine protests, uprisings, and revolutions. But for maids, rebellion was quieter, subtler, and perhaps even braver. They survived. In a world that tried to erase them, they continued to exist. They loved. In households built on inequality, they poured compassion into children, into each other, and into themselves. They remembered. They carried traditions, languages, and memories that employers tried to suppress. They dreamed, even when denied. Opportunity. They imagined better lives. For their children, for their sisters, for someone yet to come. And sometimes those dreams took root. A maid would save coins in secret, send her younger sibling to school, or manage to carve out a better future for her daughter. These small victories, multiplied across millions of lives, became quiet revolutions. Strength hidden in silence. Perhaps the greatest irony is this: society dismissed them as weak, yet their strength was unmatched. To endure endless labor, humiliation, and separation from family required resilience most people could never imagine. They weren't warriors with swords. They weren't leaders with crowns. But they were survivors who carried the weight of empires on their backs. And survival, in its purest form, is power. A transition to the final chapter. And so, as we step from the hidden worlds of these maids into the final part of our story, we confront a truth. Their legacy was never written in the history books, but it is alive in the cultures, traditions, and families shaped by their invisible hands. Because the story of the Maids is not only a story of pain, it is also a story of transformation. Invisible hands that shaped generations. Think about this. Behind every well-fed aristocrat there was a maid who cooked his meals. Behind every properly raised child of the elite, there was a maid who comforted him at night. Behind every polished mansion, there was a woman whose hands scrubbed its walls until they shone. Without them, entire societies would have collapsed. And yet, they were never thanked, never honored, rarely even remembered. But legacies don't always need monuments. Sometimes they live quietly, in the skills passed down, the songs remembered, the lessons of endurance. Cultural footprints. Maids carried culture in ways that went unnoticed but lasted centuries. Food traditions. Many families still cook dishes, learned from the hands of women who worked in their kitchens. The recipes weren't royal inventions. They were carried in the memories of maids from their own villages. Language and lullabies. Countless children grew up hearing the folk songs, nursery rhymes, and dialects of their maids, even when their families pretended not to value them. Values of care. For all the disdain employers showed, children often absorbed their sense of kindness, patience, or empathy not from parents, but from the maids who raised them. In other words, the so-called invisible class left marks far more permanent than the elite ever admitted. Echoes in today's world, and here's where the story takes a modern turn. The struggle of maids is not just history. Even today, millions of women across the world work as domestic helpers, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa. Many still face long hours, low pay, little respect, and vulnerability to abuse. When we look at them, we are looking at history repeating itself. Different uniforms, different employers, but the same invisibility. The question becomes, have we really changed? Or have we simply found new ways to hide the same injustice? Reframing their legacy. But here is the hope. By telling their stories, by naming their struggles, we begin to honor what was denied for centuries. The legacy of maids is not one of weakness. It is one of quiet revolution. They showed that even when stripped of power, human beings create meaning. Even when denied respect, they nurture life. Even when unseen, they endure. And in endurance lies a power that outlasts empires. Why this moment matters. Why does this matter now? Because we live in a time when visibility is power, where influencers, celebrities, and leaders dominate attention. And yet, history reminds us that some of the most important lives were lived in silence. The story of Maids forces us to ask, who are we overlooking today? Who is laboring in our kitchens, our streets, our factories, whose names we will never know, and more importantly, will we continue to repeat the same mistake of ignoring them, or will we finally recognize their humanity? The broader lesson. The broader lesson is simple, yet profound. Dignity should never depend on status. Every life holds value. Every worker deserves respect. Every story matters. The maids of history may never have had their portraits painted, their names carved in marble, or their stories told in classrooms. But their strength is carved into something greater, the human spirit itself. Closing reflection. So when we speak of the secret lives of maids who were never seen as human, we are not only uncovering pain, we are uncovering resilience, legacy, and truth. Their story is not just about the past. It is a mirror for the present and a call for the future. Because the next time you walk into a clean room, eat a meal prepared for you, or see a child being cared for by someone not their parent, remember, behind that labor is a life, a story, a human being who deserves to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, the most powerful revolution we can begin is this simple act, to finally see them.